Good morning. It's good to see everybody here this Monday morning, and we're here today as INPDEM, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, to announce the decision of the Black People's Grand Jury. I would like to introduce our chairman, Amalia Shatella of the African People's Socialist Party, to deliver the decision.
Thank you very much. I want to express appreciation to those of you of the media who did come out. And I want to acknowledge here with me Zaki Baruti, who is the leader of the Universal African Peoples Organization, and an organization that really functioned very much as a partner with the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement that presided over this Black People's Grand Jury. We had nearly 2 days of testimony here and evidence presented for the Black People's Grand Jury. We had a grand jury comprised of 12 people local to St. Louis County. We had 4 prosecutors, one of whom practices law in the United Kingdom and in Bahamas, another licensed to practice law in Washington, D.C., that area. And in addition to those persons who, Alex Morley and Aaron O'Neill, respectively, Zaki Baruti and I, Omali Ishatella, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, also functioned as prosecutors. We were not able to secure the actual presence of Darren Wilson, who was served the subpoena, asked to be here, especially since he seemed to be so eager to testify before a grand jury. We were not able to get the presence either of Robert McCullough, who presided over the St. Louis County grand jury process, something that we thought to be extremely important because we saw the Black People's Grand Jury not only as something that would look at the evidence relating to the actions of Darren Wilson on August 9th, 2014. But the Black People's Grand Jury we saw actually as a criticism of the grand jury that had occurred under the auspices of St. Louis County and Robert McCullough. So we felt like it was going to be extremely important for him to be here. In the absence of both Robert McCullough and Darren Wilson, we were able to show to the grand jury and to the audience that was here and live streamed throughout the world in a very transparent process, video testimony. We were able to present audio evidence from Robert McCullough talking about how he did knowingly allow persons that he knew to be lying testify on behalf of Darren Wilson, someone who he knew had actually participated as a fundraiser for Darren Wilson, in serious violation of ethical violations of his profession. So it was important we thought, to have the grand jury listen to that testimony, which suggested that the entire process was tainted from its inception. We also thought it was important for Robert McCullough to be present so that he could explain to the grand jury why there was a grand jury in the first place when he had it within his own capacity legally to use a preliminary hearing that would have allowed serious cross-examination of Darren Wilson and all witnesses and an examination of all evidence that was presented, and to do so in a transparent and open fashion. We thought that it was extraordinarily suggestive that Robert McCullough would instead use this private process and behind closed doors, and then would inundate the people who were supposed to be a part of a grand jury with more than 5,000 pages of testimony in a process which by law is only for the purpose of presenting the evidence necessary by law for an indictment. Of course, that's to show probable cause for an indictment. Robert McCullough chose not to do that. We had also with us the transcripts from the process that occurred under the leadership of Robert McCullough that showed clearly that the prosecutor's function in that grand jury, more than anything else, was to provide an explanation that would exonerate Darren Wilson for the execution on August 9th of 18-year-old Mike Brown. We also presented video testimony from Doran Johnson, who was someone with Mike Brown when he was killed by Darren Wilson on August 9th. We were not able to assess Doran Johnson in person. And after looking at the transcripts of how he was treated at the grand jury under the leadership of Robert McCullough, it is clear to us why it would be difficult and why he would be hesitant to step before a grand jury when it is extraordinary that the transcripts show that Doran Johnson, who was a witness to a murder, was treated as a criminal, and the person who actually executed Mike Brown was treated with kid gloves before that grand jury. We had testimony also, video testimony, from Serial West, who is a forensic pathologist, who offered an explanation that challenged everything that Darren Wilson, Bob McCullough, and many people, especially in national media, suggested was a reasonable explanation for why Mike Brown, 6'4", was shot in the top of his head. The notion, of course, that after having been wounded by Darren Wilson and concerned enough to run away, would turn around unarmed and then would chase or would attempt to tackle and arm Darren Wilson that had already demonstrated his willingness to shoot him. And so we presented that testimony. We presented video testimony from other forces, a woman who sat in her car and watched him executed and who participated before the grand jury of Bob McCullough, a man who watched from his window and saw the execution, all of them corroborating the testimony by Doran Johnson about how Mike Brown was killed. This is some of the evidence that we presented before the grand jury. But in addition to that, we felt it was absolutely necessary to show that there is a pattern of behavior by police in this county toward African people, to show that there is an historical relationship that does exist in this county toward African people. We had testimony from the parents of Vonderette Myers, who talked about how their child was killed. We had testimony from the parents of Carrie Ball, another victim of police murder in this county, who talked about what happened with them. We had a man to come forward and testify about how in the middle of a domestic dispute, the police would arrive and rather than treat him civilly and even question him, would have dogs put on him, injure him while they watched the dogs do that. This man happened to have been a Vietnam veteran who had served this country and who thought that he understood how to work with the police in a very respectable way. This is some of the testimony that we had. It was a very serious and historic process, I must say. And it was very clear that the grand jurors took their responsibility seriously as well. We could tell that by some of the questions that were asked by the grand jury before they went to begin their deliberations. And that included the question of whether or not there could be other charges. Interestingly, on at least one occasion, whether a lesser charge would be something that would be permissible. We called on the grand jury to understand that the charges that were put forward, the possible charges were first and second degree murder. And that the reason for this is that they had a responsibility, and we had a responsibility in this instance to apply law to the facts of the case. And we were convinced that the facts of the case clearly demonstrated that Darren Wilson had an opportunity to choose differently, but instead chose to execute 18-year-old Mike Brown and did so. This was the charge that we gave to the grand jury. There was, the grand jury then retired to deliberate and to do so out of the presence of the prosecutors. So it was their own deliberation that took place. And they came back within an hour to bring forth their verdict. And it was the verdict of this grand jury, this historic Black People's grand jury, that was here to make a statement to the world that we are not helpless in the face of decisions made by people that would victimize us, that would make mothers responsible for burying their children as teenagers. We were not helpless. And so this grand jury, taking this charge very seriously, came back with the determination that Darren Wilson must be indicted for first-degree murder. Thank you. Yeah.
You did a good job.
Okay.
Sir, could you spell your name for us, please?
My first name is spelled O-M-A-L-I, O'Malley. My last name is Y-E-S-H-I-T-E-L-A, Ishitella. I think one of the grand jurors is with us as well. In the event there is any need to discuss the deliberation, something I have not done. And I don't know if Zaki Baruti wanted to make any statements.
Well, the only statement that I can make is, first of all, salute Brother O'Malley Yesatele as the lead prosecutor with the importance of this Black People's Grand Jury being very historic, being a statement that we as a people must become self-determinant, and we cannot allow those outside of our community to determine what we deem as necessary steps for justice. So it's in that spirit that our organization proudly stood with this process. As he mentioned, it was very transparent. It's very transparent in terms of the grand jury. Members were able to ask a number of questions of the people who gave testimony, as well as we opened it up for the public. So it set a precedent. It set a precedent in terms of if there is to be justice here in this country, then there needs to be a total different approach to incidents, especially racial incidents, in which the accused many times are white police officers who so many times in this country are set free and through legal loopholes. It sets a precedent that if there are to be grand juries outside of our community, minimally, grand juries are to be of equal numbers of black and whites participating, if there are to be a need for a grand jury. But as my brother pointed out, Bob McCullough didn't even need that process. He just set the stage to project the mockery of what happened several months, with his decision that Darren Wilson was not to be indicted.
Thank you.
So you were the lead prosecutor on this?
I was.
Okay. Can I ask you, what's the message that you want sent? Obviously, this decision holds no legal bearing here, but I mean, what's the message to come out of this? Why is this significant in your mind?
Well, the first thing I want to say is this. Slavery was legal. The question for us is not whether an oppressor's law is legal or not. The question of whether it is oppressive. The message, more than anything, was to black people, African people in this country, who are victimized by police terror and murder throughout this country. If it were simply a case of one individual having been killed on August 9th, the community in Ferguson would not have rebelled the way it did. It could have been passed off as an accident. It could have been passed off as a possible just shooting, but that wasn't the case. And we also saw that immediately after that, Von Derek Myers over on Shaw was gunned down, shot 8 times, 7 of which were in the back. We saw in July before that the public execution of Eric Garner, choked to death. And I'm not even sure the choking was the worst part of the crime. Anybody who saw what happened, the inhumane way that he was treated, with his head by police being pushed through the pavement. There's something that's happening in this country and has been happening for a long time. For the duration of our presence in this country as black people, we've been struggling to try and end the oppression of our people, starting with trying to rid ourselves of a process of having been kidnapped and forced labor that built the economy of this country. It's this forced labor, this economy, upon which the legal foundation of America rests. So when we say it has no legal bearings, actually Nat Turner, who led a rebellion to kill slave masters and overturn slavery, was brought to court, was tried, convicted, called guilty. He made the statement then, I don't feel guilty. I don't think he was guilty either. He was guilty of a crime because slavery was legal. So to say that this has no legal bearing, I think, is to misunderstand what this is about.
Yeah, let me rephrase it. What's significant about it then?
What's significant about it, as Brother Zaki Baruti just mentioned, it is a step in the direction of self-determination. It is something that's being done in the face of demonstrations, protests happening around this country around police violence. Many times, this is protest that doesn't seem to have direction. Many times it doesn't seem to be aimed toward any end. What this process we've engaged in says is there must be an end, and that end is self-determination. That black people must take control of our lives. We cannot trust our children, the future of our community, in the hands of this establishment that has proved to us over and over again its disregard for black life. So it is a step towards self-determination. To have 2 courts have occurred, 2 hearings, 2 grand juries, we heard more or less the same evidence. We applied here, however, the law. Grand juries are not trials. Bob McCullough's inundation of the people with 5,000 pages of testimony violated every principle of what a grand jury is about that's ever applied any place in this country. Grand juries are for the purpose simply of getting the evidence and information that would inform a determination of whether an indictment should happen, and that is simply probable cause that a crime has been committed. Bob McCullough himself, and I heard him say it, and that testimony was provided for the grand jury, that the testimony of Doran Johnson alone was enough for an indictment. He chose not to do that. Instead, he chose to bring witness number 40, who he said he knew was lying, who testified over 2 days in defense of Darren Wilson, I guess taking a break from her fundraising efforts that rewarded Darren Wilson for the execution of Mike Brown. This was a black people's grand jury. That was an extraordinarily serious event. We heard nothing from anybody. Anybody in the world who wanted to see what happened and whether it was a just proceeding had an opportunity to do that. They could walk through these doors and have a seat in the auditorium. They could watch it online from any place in the world, which is not something that Bob McCullough and St. Louis County can say about what they did with the case of Darren Wilson and Mike Brown.